Hello everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of the podcast. Today I bring you episode 88, which is the fourth episode in this series on the protostome side of the animal kingdom, and it's the second episode in this mini-series exploring the arthropods. Previously in the main protostome series, we looked at the world of protostome worms, including all kinds of clades of worm-like creatures. And then we looked at the exotic and alien diversity of the mollusks, like the gastropods and the cephalopods. After that, we began to explore the arthropods. We started with the oldest living major lineage, the chelicerates, and its wide diversity of spiders, scorpions, mites and ticks, and other kinds of creepy crawlies. Well, today we're going to continue our exploration of the world's creeping and crawling things, by turning our attention to the next major clade that emerged among the arthropods. These are the Myriapods, the millipedes, the centipedes, and all of their many-legged cousins. Their name, Myriapod, has the prefix myria, or myriad, which means many or a lot, but if you were to put a specific number to it, historically it would mean about 10,000. It was supposed to be just a really big, large number. In reality, the species of the Myriapods do have many legs, they do have many feet, but they have far fewer than 10,000. Some species have so few legs that you can actually count them on all of your fingers, while the largest Myriapods only have hundreds of legs, not thousands. If I remember correctly, there was one species of millipede that was recently discovered, and it did have more than 1,000 legs, but that's pretty much the only example. One of the first things that you'll notice about the Myriapods, if you're studying them as a clade in relation to other clades like crustaceans or arachnids or something, one of the first things you'll notice about the Myriapods is their relative lack of biodiversity. This is something that seems almost weird to say when you're talking about arthropods. Every other group in the arthropod phylum is characterized by extreme biodiversity. For example, in the previous episode we explored the chelicerates, with a focus on the arachnids, which include a stupid huge diversity among over 100,000 named species that take countless forms, which live across the planet and inhabit virtually every habitat except for the frozen polar wastelands, and they inhabit almost every terrestrial ecological niche except for those that involve flight. In future episodes, we'll explore the crustaceans and the hexapods. The hexapods include the insects, which are similar to the arachnids in the sense that they are represented by an absolutely stunning, unparalleled level of biodiversity. Except the insects are even more biodiverse than arachnids, with about 1 million described species and an estimated 5.5 million species total, which live in just as many habitats as the arachnids, but fill an even wider variety of ecological niches, because, unlike the spiders, the insects include countless species that can fly, or that are herbivorous. The crustaceans are also quite biodiverse, including parasitic, herbivorous, and carnivorous species, terrestrial and aquatic species, and mobile and sessile species. They have about 70,000 described species in total, so they're not as biodiverse as the insects or the arachnids, but with all the woodlice and barnacles and crabs and prawns and whatnot, they make a pretty good showing nonetheless. Now, the reason that I bring all of this up is to really illustrate the difference here between these other arthropod groups and the Myriapods. Compared to all of the other arthropod cousins, the Myriapods only have some 16,000 described species, which is a fraction of all of their other arthropod cousin clades. The Myriapods also live in a relatively narrow range of habitats, mostly just various types of damp forest soil. But in some cases they also live in the sandy, muddy, or swampy soils of a coastal habitat. Rarely you might find a centipede or a millipede who lives in a drier habitat, perhaps a semi-arid grassland, but it's definitely not as common. Most of these species live in the damp, moist leaf litter in a forest floor. Ecologically, the Myriapods are almost all herbivorous detrivores, breaking down dead and decaying plant matter and recycling it into bioavailable nutrients that enrich the soil for other living organisms like plants and fungi and all the other soil-dwelling animals. There is an exception, though. the centipedes are not herbivores. They're not detrivores. The centipedes are primarily carnivorous predators that are active at night. So, that mixes things up a bit, that adds a bit of diversity, but that's about it. While the myriapods have relatively low biodiversity, and they exploit a relatively small portion of all available niches, they're excellent at what they do, and the ecological services they provide are incredibly valuable and critical for recycling nutrients in their moist, vegetable-rich habitat. Things start to get a bit more interesting when we look at myriapod evolution. Now, I'm not going to get into too much detail on this topic here, because I have a future episode planned that will be exclusively focused on myriapod evolutionary history, but for now, we'll skim over some of the important points. In the middle of the Silurian period, at least as late as around 430 to 450 million years ago, the earliest ancestral populations of the myriapods emerged and rapidly diversified. Key to their evolutionary success was segmentation and various mutations that replicated and altered these distinct body segments. Specifically, they took on the general form of long-bodied, worm-like arthropods composed of a chain of connected segments. Each body segment contains a copy of an organ or several organs and a pair of legs, and these structures are replicated over and over and over again along the chain of segments. Over the course of evolutionary history, some mutations have occurred, and these mutations have altered some of these legs or these appendages into different kinds of specialized structures, as you'll soon learn. But to keep things general for the time being, each of these body segments is produced by a small toolkit of genes, and the whole body is built by simply expressing this toolkit over and over and over again. This is the highly efficient functional utility of these genetic toolkits. And as they're so extremely useful, when they were evolved, they were passed down and preserved across the animal kingdom. In fact, we've seen that the toolkit genes that produce the legs of a fly come from the same genetic ancestor as the human toolkit genes that produce our arms and legs. A similar set of toolkit genes also produces our fingers and toes, as is the case in other primates. So it could be argued that the myriapods represent the use of toolkit genes just taken to an extreme. As the myriapods have more repeating body segments than virtually any other animal on the planet, they represent a form of life that has maximized its utilization of the toolkit genes to effectively construct their entire body, and this defines their behavior, their movement, their habitat, and their ecology. The early myriapods were basically running this highly modular, highly segmented body platform, and it worked out pretty well for them. They were able to thrive, and they diversified rapidly in the beginning of their evolutionary history. This early period of divergence produced at least 5 monophyletic lineages, or clades, that we know today. There's 5 that are known to science, but new fossil discoveries could always change that. That there's probably a 6th or a 7th, or more, in the form of fossils hidden in the ground that just haven't been discovered yet. But anyways, among the 5 known clades of myriapods, one of them, the Arthropoda, is totally extinct. The other 4 are currently extant. They have a bunch of species that are currently alive today, and so they'll be the main focus of today's episode. To start off our exploration of this particular branch of the tree of life, we'll look at the Symphyla, also known as the pseudocentipedes, or the garden centipedes. Of course, note that these aren't actually true centipedes. Among the myriapods, they're not even the most closely related to the centipedes. What genomic data exists suggests that they're more closely related to the parapods. In addition, they're almost entirely blind, non-venomous detrivores. Some of them eat decaying plant matter, while others eat the dead tissue of both plants and animals. There's at least one species of Symphyla that is predatory, that is a carnivore, and that makes it an unusual exception among its peers. Now, if I could describe these with a single poetic sentence, I would say that they're small, ghostly creatures, translucent and fragile, silently squirming through soft and sodden soil with their small, spindly legs, and sensing the muddy world around them with their large, segmented, forward-facing antennae. They're fascinating creatures, partly because of their pale, ghost-like appearance in the soil, and partly because we know so little about them, aside from the most rudimentary basics. Now remember that the Myriapods are the least diverse group of arthropods. And among the Myriapods, the Symphyla are probably the least diverse internal clade. And this is a bit strange, because the oldest fossils that we have of these Symphyla, they can be found in the famous Myanmar amber deposits, and these date back to around 99 to 100 million years ago. But the bulk of their fossils, the vast majority of their fossils that we found, are from much more recent years. There's two conclusions that we can take away from this. The first is that their fossils don't seem to form very easily or readily, and if they do form, they don't seem to last too long. And this is why, of all the fossils that we found, the vast majority of them are from relatively recent evolutionary history. We found very few fossils outside of Myanmar amber deposits that go back anywhere close to 100 million years. And yet, despite all of this time available to them for diversification, the clade never really seems to have taken advantage of it. They just haven't diversified that much. For example, here's a really weird fact. There's approximately 5 species known from the fossil record, and all 5 of those species are still alive today. So what this means is that you have these 5 species of symphylans that have lived for so long that some of the earlier individuals, the earlier generations, have died and been fossilized, and we found their fossils. But that species is still going strong. There's still more individuals breeding and reproducing. And that's pretty impressive because for most animals, especially for vertebrates, by the time we find a fossil of something, it's long gone. And if that species has any descendants that are still alive today, they usually look quite different from the fossils of their ancestors. Of all of the symphylan species that are alive today, there's approximately 100 described species that have been divided almost evenly into 2 families. And just so you know, I'm getting these numbers from the ITIS Species 2000 Catalog of Life. So if you want to look this up, if you want to see some of the other species or some of the species of literally any other type of organism, you can check out that catalog. Anyway, let's look at these 2 symphylan families. There's the Scolopendrelidae family, which has, according to the Catalog of Life, 46 described species. And then there's the Scutigorellidae family, which has 54 species. All the species in each family are all pretty similar in size, shape, and appearance. In fact, the easiest way to tell them apart is that the Scolopendrelidae have 2 rows of small spines running along their back, and a more angular snake-like shape to their heads, whereas the Scutigorellidae have a more blunted, rounded head shape. Within the Scolopendrelidae, there are at least 8 genera, most of which, such as the Geophyllella, the Pseudoscutigorella, and the Remissymphila, and several other genera, they're defined by only 1 or 2 species. The Scolopendrella genus has 3 species, and the Scolopendrolopsis genus just has 8 species. More than half of the species in the Scolopendrelidae family, no less than 28 of them, exist in a single genus known as Symphylla. Now the other major Symphyla family, Scutigorellidae, is a bit more evenly distributed. There's 3 genera, and only one of them, the Scolopendroloides, is defined by a single species. The other 2 genera, the Hansenella and the Scutigorella, are characterized by 24 and 29 living species, respectively. Alright, moving along the Myriapod clade, after the Symphyla, we come to the Pauropods, or the Arthropoda. As might be expected, these guys are really similar to their Symphyla cousins, in the sense that they're all very small, they look like segmented worms with legs, and they live in the soil and the leaf litter on the forest floor. The Arthropoda share many physiological similarities with the millipedes, such as a lupoid phase at the end of their embryonic development, and in mature adults they possess 3 pairs of mouthpart appendages. This physiological similarity to the millipedes suggests an ancient evolutionary origin of the Pauropods. However, the fossil record is curiously devoid of Pauropod samples older than approximately 40 million years. This might be because of similar factors and variables that affected the formation of fossils in the Symphyla. Something about their bodies and their habitats just isn't necessarily too conducive to fossil formation. And on that note, if they do form fossils, they're also really hard to find. And these two facts go a long way to explain the relative paucity of Symphyla and Pauropod fossils. The modern class of Pauropoda can be divided into two orders. These are the Hexamerocerata order, which exists exclusively in the wet, warm soils of tropical regions like Madagascar, the Seychelles, the rainforests of Brazil and Africa, and there are even some found in the southern regions of Japan. The other Pauropod order, the Tetramerocerata, these are much less habitat-specific. They can be found in a much wider variety of biomes that cover most of the planet, not just wet, humid tropical soils. Now, in addition to this difference in preferred living space, each order of Pauropod is also characterized by a few specific morphological details with respect to their numbers of legs and body segments and whatnot. So for example, the Hexamerocerata have 12 body segments and 11 pairs of legs, where the Tetramerocerata tend to be a bit smaller but more variable, with generally 10 or fewer body segments, but depending on the species, 8 to 10 pairs of legs, although most species present 9 pairs of legs in the adult stage. The Hexamerocerata are definitely the smaller group. Within this order, there's only one family, the Militaropodidae, and within this one family, there's only a single genus, the Milotauropus. And within this one genus, according to a reclassification study published in the International Journal of Myriapodology, there's only 8 known species. These include the M. acosti, which lives in the western depths of the Amazon rainforest, and the M. temporalis, which live in a diamond-shaped region of eastern Brazil bordered by the Atlantic Ocean to the east and the deltas of the Amazon River to the south. The other order, the Tetramerocerata, contains a much more biodiverse selection of smaller organisms. It includes no less than 480 species divided into 12 families. Most of these families include just a small handful of species, like the Diplopauropodidae and the Hansenaropodidae, with just 4 species each. And then there's also the Polypauropodidae and the Europauropodidae, which have 22 and 32 species, respectively. But the vast majority of Tetramerocerata species are grouped into a single family, the Pauropodidae. And according to the ITIS Catalog of Life, the Pauropodidae family has close to 400 species, although some sources put the number of species closer to 650. The more diverse clades within the Tetramerocerata include all manner of millimeter-sized aquatic detrivores, forest detrivores, leaf and grassland-dwelling herbivores, and a host of assorted soil-bound decomposers and tiny scavengers. Moving right along, we come to the next group in the Myriapod clade. These are creatures of the class Diplopoda. These diplopods might be known to you by a more familiar name, the millipedes. The name, with its prefix milli, suggests that the millipedes have 1,000 legs, as if that's normal for the clade. But the truth is, it's not. Although they are certainly well endowed with many small little creeping pairs of legs, until as recently as 2021, there had been no millipede species discovered that actually had 1,000 legs. For the longest time, the biggest millipede species, the species with the most legs, was the Alacme plenipes, which had 750 legs. This only changed in 2021, when scientists in Australia discovered a new species of millipede that has over 1,300 legs. This newly discovered millipede lives deep underground, about 200 feet underground, so it's also pretty pale, and it has no eyes. The scientists who discovered it named it Eumillipes persephone, which is the species name is named after the Greek goddess Persephone, who was taken by Hades, god of the underworld, and so Persephone became the queen of the underworld. I think that's a pretty fitting title for this millipede, because it lives underground, deep underground, and it also holds the crown for having the most legs, not just of any millipede, but of any species on the planet. Now, if we were to compare the millipedes to the other two groups that we've looked at so far, the Symphyla and the Pauropoda, the Diplopoda are much more species-rich. They're much more diverse, like 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more diverse. There's over 12,000 known species of modern millipedes, and they're divided into 16 orders and approximately 140 families. There are some estimates that suggest that the true number of millipede species throughout the world may be between 15 to 20,000, although a study published in 2007 in the journal Annual Review of Entomology suggests that there may be as many as 80,000 diplopod species, in which case the vast majority of them are still unknown to science, living their lives hidden away in the soil or leaf litter in some steamy jungle or dusty grassland, just waiting to be discovered. Now within the diplopod class, there are 3 unequal subclasses. One of the more basal subclasses are the Arthropoda, which includes 3 orders, and all of them are extinct. One of these orders, the Arthropoda, includes the Arthropoda genus, and according to the fossil record, this particular genus represents the first known land-dwelling animal to inhabit the North American continent, having emerged sometime in the late Silurian period more than 400 million years ago. This is another one of those really cool details that I'm going to expand more on in that future episode on myriapod evolution. The myriapods are believed to have been the first invertebrate animals to colonize dry land, so they can actually lay claim to a really important evolutionary achievement in the Earth's history. Another extinct order within the Arthropoda class is the Arthropoda, and this includes the Arthropoda genus. Among the many species in this extinct genus are the largest known land-dwelling invertebrates of all time. They existed about 345 to 295 million years ago, when there was a much greater partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. This allowed some of them to grow to colossal sizes, such as the Arthropoda armata, which could be as long as 2.5 meters, or about 7 to 8 feet long. Despite this massive size, the lack of hard mouthparts suggests that they weren't predatory, they weren't carnivores. In fact, based on chemical analysis of their guts, they were either herbivores, feeding off of primitive ferns and other lycopods, or they ate the soft, mealy excrement of other organisms, in which case they would be coprophores. Another one of the most basal Diplopoda subclasses, which is not extinct but very much alive, is the Pennicillata. This subclass contains no less than 86 species all wrapped up in a single order known as the Polyzonida. These so-called pincushion millipedes are small, soft-bodied creatures no more than 1/3 of an inch long, and they lack the defensive chemicals that are characteristic of other millipede groups. To defend themselves, they've evolved a characteristic set of bristles or spiny hairs, which are designed to break off so as to stab into the body, tangle up the legs, or jam up the mouthparts of all of the larger arthropods that try to eat them. Some of the Polyzonidae families include the Lophoproctidae, which have clumps of bristles at the rear joint edge of each major body segment. There's the Polyzonidae family, which also has these segment tufts, as well as more bristles along their sides and back, and the Synzonidae family, which tend to have longer bristles, particularly around their posterior. By far, the largest Diplopoda subclass is the Cheilognatha, which includes 15 of the 16 currently extant millipede orders. These include the broad, flat species of the Glomerodesmida, which dwell in the world's tropical forests and caves, the chunky pill millipedes of the Glomerida order, the giant pill millipedes of the Spherotheriida order, which can roll up into a ball the size of a berry, or a ping-pong ball, and which also includes the only millipede species known to produce a sound. There's also the long, flattened, fungus-eating millipedes of the Platydesmida order, which are characterized by the unique lateral extensions of carapace that branch off of each body segment, and they're known for their penchant for engaging in paternal care of their offspring, which is really, really unusual among all of the arthropods. There's also the short, stubby, flat millipedes of the Siphonocryptida and the Polyzoniida orders, and the long, blind, tube-like millipedes of the Siphononophorida order, which includes the Alacme plenipes species that I mentioned earlier. Furthermore, there are the sausage-like Chordumatida millipedes, which include species that live almost everywhere from the tropics of Southeast Asia to the frosty mountains of Europe. There's the crested millipedes of the Calopodida order, the tall and narrow millipedes of the Stemiulida order, and the small, blind, and very poorly understood millipedes of the Siphoniolus order. More recently derived orders include the Julida, which enjoy more temperate biomes, the round-backed Spirobolida order, and the 1,000 tropical species of large, long, worm-like millipedes in the Spirostreptida order. The largest, most biodiverse diplopod clade is the flat-backed Polydesmida order, which includes over 3,500 species. The polydesmids prefer to live in the leaf litter on the forest floor, where they eat young, soft, herbaceous plants and decaying plant matter. To ward off predators, they possess frighteningly bright coloration, and they secrete a variety of hazardous chemicals. For example, the polydesmids include all the species of millipede that secrete hydrogen cyanide. Well, that wraps up the diplopods, and this brings us to our final class within the myriapods. These are the chylopods, also known as the centipedes. Unlike almost all the other groups that I've mentioned so far today, the centipedes are largely predatory. The majority of them are carnivores that hunt and eat smaller arthropods like insects and arachnids, and sometimes even small lizards, which they can take down due to their effective venom-injecting pincers. Similar to the millipedes, the centipedes have a prefix in their name. It means 100, but this doesn't accurately reflect the number of legs that they actually have. Just as no millipede has 1,000 legs, except for that one species that was discovered just a year or two ago, similarly, no centipede has 100 legs. All 3,000 known species of centipede have an odd number of pairs of legs. Some species have as few as 15 pairs of legs, while others have as many as 177 pairs, but none of them have exactly 50 pairs. It's one of those silly idiosyncrasies where the naming convention is an obnoxiously inaccurate descriptor of the species in question. The centipedes are also some of the largest myriapods, and the most dangerous, even to humans. Within the class Myriapoda, there's 5 orders, and in order of their evolutionary emergence from oldest to most recent, these are the Scutigeromorpha, the Lithobiomorpha, the Craterostigmomorpha, and most recently, the Scolopendromorpha and the Geophilomorpha. The Scutigeromorpha includes 3 families, the Scutigeridae, the Scutigerinidae, and the Celiotidae, which all include species that are characterized by unusually long legs and antennae. Many of the species in these families, such as the Sphenonemma goldingii and the Scutigera coleoptrata, have really long spider-like legs. In that sense, they actually look kind of like elongated spiders with dozens of legs. The Lithobiomorpha family also goes by the moniker of the stone centipedes, as they tend to enjoy the dark, moist soils that can be found underneath a nice big rock. Here, they scurry around in the darkness to hunt down smaller bugs and worms. Many of them have evolved to lose their eyesight, as it's generally a waste of resources in these lightless, cramped habitats, especially where your sense of smell will be much more useful. Now, the other Lithobiomorpha species are nocturnal, and this exposes them to a similar evolutionary pressure. They're not awake and moving around during the day, they're only awake and moving around during the night, so similarly, they don't really need to use their eyes for hunting or anything, so they've evolved to lose them. The Lithobiomorpha has 2 families. There's 120 species in the Henocopidae family, and there's more than 500 species in the Lithobius family. Moving on, the Craterostigmomorpha is a small chylopod clade that includes only 2 species in a single genus. A 2008 genomic study published in the journal Invertebrate Systematics described the relationship of these intermediate centipedes and their more ancient and more modern cousins as being akin to the awkwardly intermediate platypus and its relationship to more modern and more archaic mammals. These Craterostigmomorpha chylopods can be found in Tasmania and New Zealand. Now, the most recently emerged orders are the Scolopendromorpha, also known as the tropical centipedes, and the Geophilomorpha, also known as the soil centipedes. The Scolopendromorpha includes 5 diverse families of black, brown, yellow, and orange-colored centipedes, and included among these species are the Scolopendra cataracta and the Scolopendra paradoxa, which are the only known amphibious centipedes. The soil centipedes of the Geophilomorpha order includes over 1,200 species divided into 7 families, and most, if not all of them, are blind. The Geophilomorpha is diverse and widespread, with many species, such as the Pachymeриum farunganium, that live in hot and cold and dry and wet habitats across the world, from Scandinavia and Alaska, to Japan and Spain, to tropical islands off the coast of Africa. Okay, everyone. So that about wraps up the Myriapod clade and all of its major constituent classes, orders, and families, and sprinkled in were a handful of noteworthy or interesting species. Despite being a small clade, the Myriapods are a really important clade, as they play a fundamental role in the food web. The centipedes represent an effective group of predators that keep the population of insects and other bugs in the soil in check, while the other groups facilitate the breakdown of plant matter and nutrient cycling into the soil. And all of them provide abundant food for larger animals, particularly small vertebrates like lizards, rodents, and birds, and this makes the Myriapods an integral link near the bottom of the food chain. Although they're discreet and unassuming, living quietly under rocks, in the soil, and in the shadows, they are a critically and irreplaceably important part of the Earth's ecosystems. In the next episode, we'll move on to the next major group of arthropods, the crustaceans. This large and diverse clade includes all manner of organisms, from krill and barnacles, to shrimp and crabs, to lobsters and crayfish, to a whole lot more. It'll be an extremely fascinating and skin-crawling episode, so be sure to hit that subscribe button and check it out. If you enjoyed this episode, then hit the like button, or if you're listening to it through the Apple Store, give it a 5-star review. If you want to support the show in other ways, consider checking out the Patreon page and maybe becoming a Patreon supporter, or check out the official store and buy some of my cool biology art. Anything you do to support the show is awesome. And as always, thank you so much for listening.